Hello everybody, we're going to hit you up with another presidential election. This one, the election of 1968. Three-way race, really important election. Who's going to win it? Let's find that out right now. Now, before we get into the candidates, it's going to be very important to put this election in the context. This is something we don't normally do. We go right to the candidates, but this election is so important that we have to put it in context. In the last election, the incumbent president, the Democrat Lyndon Johnson of Texas, won the largest popular vote landslide in U.S. presidential election history over Republican Barry Goldwater. During the presidential term that followed, Johnson was able to achieve many political successes, including the passage of his sweeping Great Society domestic programs, landmark civil rights legislation, and the continued exploration of space. At the same time, however, the country endured large-scale race riots in the streets of its larger cities, along with a generational revolt of young people and violent debates over foreign policy. The emergence of the hippie counterculture and the rise of New Left activism and the emergence of the Black Power movement exacerbated social and cultural clashes between classes, generations, and races. Adding to the national crisis, on April 4th, 1968, civil rights leader Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, igniting further mass rioting and chaos, including Washington, D.C., where there was rioting within just a few blocks of the White House, and machine guns were stationed on the Capitol steps to protect it. So already, crazy year, 1968. Now, the most important reason for the precipitous decline of Johnson's popularity was the Vietnam War, which he greatly escalated during his time in office. By late 1967, over 500,000 American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam. Draftees made up 42% of the military in Vietnam, but suffered 58% of the casualties, as nearly 1,000 Americans a month were killed and many more were injured. Johnson's position was particularly damaged when the national news media began to focus on the high costs and ambiguous results of the escalation, despite his repeated efforts to downplay the seriousness of the situation. In early January 1968, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stated that the war would be winding down as the North Vietnamese were losing their will to fight. But shortly thereafter, they launched the Tet Offensive, in which the North Vietnamese and Communist Viet Cong forces launched simultaneous attacks on all government strongholds in South Vietnam. The Tet episode led many Americans to ponder whether the war was winnable or worth it. In addition, they felt they could not trust their government's assessment and reporting of the war effort. The Pentagon called for sending several 100,000 more soldiers to Vietnam. Johnson's approval rating fell below 35%, and the Secret Service refused to let the president make public appearances on the campuses of American colleges and universities due to his extreme unpopularity among college students. The Secret Service also prevented Johnson from appearing at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago because it could not guarantee his safety from assassination. So already, crazy year. Cray year 1968. Well, it's going to get more cray. Let's go to the candidates. So we're going to start off with the incumbent party, and then it's the Democratic Party. The incumbent Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, elected ascending to the presidency in 1963 following JFK's assassination, and was reelected to a full term in 1964. But by 1968, as I've said, his popularity was on the decline, mainly due to the Vietnam War. So on March 31st, 1968, he decides not to run for a second full term as president. So the Democratic nomination, wide open. And it came down to Vice President Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, and Senator George McGovern of South Dakota. Now the Democrats are going to end up splitting into 4 factions, 3 with all these factions distrusting each other. The first faction consisted of labor unions and big city bosses, and this group had traditionally controlled the party since the days of FDR, and they feared that their control would be lost. And after LBJ withdrew, they rallied to support Vice President Humphrey. And it was also believed that Johnson himself was covertly supporting Humphrey despite his public claims of neutrality. Now, the second faction rallied behind Senator McCarthy. This was composed of college students, intellectuals, and upper middle class whites who had been the early activists against the war in Vietnam. They perceived themselves as the future of the Democratic Party. The third group was mainly composed of Catholics, blacks, and other minorities, as well as several anti-war groups, and these groups rallied behind Senator Kennedy. The fourth group consisted of white Southern Democrats. Some older men, remembering the New Deal's positive impact upon the rural South, supported Humphrey, but many would rally behind the third-party campaign of George Wallace as a law and order candidate. And we'll talk about his campaign we'll talk about his party in just a second. Now, on June 5th, 1968, a guy named Sirhan Sirhan shoots Senator Kennedy in California. Shoots Senator Kennedy in California. He just won the California primary, and he dies the next day. So he's out of the running, obviously, for the Democratic nomination. And after a Democratic National Convention, which was crazy itself, racked with anti-war protests, Hubert Humphrey receives the nomination for the Democratic Party for president. And he's going to bring along for the ride Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine as his running mate. Now that we have the Democratic ticket of Humphrey and Muskie, let's go to the Republicans. Now, the Republican nomination is just as wide open as the Democratic nomination is, and the candidates putting themselves up was Richard Nixon of New York, the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, the governor of Michigan, George W. Romney, Harold Stassen of Minnesota, Senator Charles H. Percy of Illinois, and Senator Jacob K. Javits of New York. And at the end of the day, it is going to be Nixon who receives the Republican nomination for president, and he's going to bring along for the ride a dark horse named Spiro Agnew, the governor of Maryland, as his running mate. Now that we have a Republican ticket of Nixon and Agnew, let's go to the American Independent Party. Now, the American Independent Party was formed in 1967 by Bill and Eileen Sherrier, and they nominated George Wallace of Alabama as their presidential candidate. Wallace was a segregationist, but his policies began to be rejected by the mainstream of the Democratic Party. Now, he is going to select Curtis LeMay of California as his running mate for vice president. And Wallace knew that he wasn't going to win the election. He didn't expect to win the election, but he was hoping to prevent either major party candidate from winning a preliminary majority in the Electoral College. And of course, the election would then be thrown into the House of Representatives, and which would then give him bargaining power to determine the winner. Now, LeMay is going to embarrass Wallace's campaign by suggesting that nuclear weapons could be used in Vietnam. Now that we have our three-way race, Democratic ticket of Humphrey and Muskie, a Republican ticket of Nixon and Agnew, and our American Independent ticket of Wallace and LeMay, let's put these guys into the ring and let's see who's going to win this thing. Now Nixon, he's going to develop a Southern strategy that was designed to appeal to conservative white Southerners who traditionally voted Democratic but were deeply angered by Johnson and Humphrey's support for the civil rights movement, as well as the rioting that had broken out in the ghettos of most large cities. Wallace, however, won over many of the votes Nixon targeted, effectively splitting the conservative vote. Indeed, Wallace deliberately targeted many states he had little chance of carrying himself in the hope that by splitting the conservative vote with Nixon, he would give those states to Humphrey and by extension boost his own chances of denying both opponents an electoral college majority. Since he was well behind Nixon in the polls as the campaign began, Humphrey opted for a slashing, fighting campaign style. He repeatedly and unsuccessfully challenged Nixon to a televised debate, and he often compared his campaign to the successful underdog effort of President Harry Truman, another Democrat who had trailed in the polls in the 1948 election. If you haven't seen that video, go ahead and watch it because it's a little bit cray-cray. Humphrey predicted that he, like Truman, would surprise the experts and win an upset victory. Now, Nixon is going to campaign on a theme to restore law and order, which appealed to many voters angry with the hundreds of violent riots that had taken place across the country in the past few years. Following the assassination of Martin Luther King in April of '68, there was severe rioting in Detroit and Washington, and President Johnson had to call out the army to protect lives and property as smoke from burning buildings a few blocks away drifted across the White House lawn. However, Humphrey criticized the law and order issue, claiming that it was a subtle appeal to white racial prejudice. Nixon also opposed forced busing to desegregate schools. Proclaiming himself a supporter of civil rights, he recommended education as the solution rather than militancy. During the campaign, Nixon proposed government tax incentives to African Americans for small businesses and home improvements in their existing neighborhoods. During the campaign, Nixon also used as a theme his opposition to the decisions of Chief Justice Earl Warren. Earl Warren, the Republican vice presidential nominee from 1948. Many conservatives were critical of Chief Justice Warren for using the Supreme Court to promote liberal policies in the fields of civil rights, civil liberties, and the separation of church and state. Nixon promised that if he were elected president, he would appoint justices who would take a less active role in creating social policy. And another campaign promise, he pledged to end the draft. There in the 1960s, Nixon had been impressed by a paper he had read by Professor Martin Anderson of Columbia University. Anderson argued in the paper for an end to the draft and the creation of an all-volunteer army. Nixon also saw ending the draft as an effective way to undermine the anti-Vietnam War movement, since he believed affluent college-age youths would stop protesting the war once their own possibility of having to fight in it was gone. Meanwhile, Humphrey promised to continue and expand the Great Society welfare program started by President Johnson and to continue the war on poverty. He also promised to continue the efforts of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson and the Supreme Court in promoting the expansion of civil rights and civil liberties for minority groups. However, Humphrey also felt constrained for most of his campaign in voicing any opposition to Johnson's Vietnam War policies, due to his fear that Johnson would reject any peace proposals he made and undermine his campaign. As a result, early on, Humphrey often found himself the target of anti-war protesters, some of whom heckled and disrupted his campaign rallies. And now, with the campaign over with, let's head on to the results. Three-way race, and the Republicans are going to come out on top. Richard Nixon is going to win this election. He will receive 301 electoral votes. Hubert Humphrey and the Democrats, 191. And George Wallace and the American Independents, 46. 32 states are going to vote for Nixon and the Republicans. 13 states and Washington, D.C. are going to vote for Hubert Humphrey and the Democrats. In the states of Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, in the states of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia are all going to vote for George Wallace and the American Independent Party. Now, in terms of the popular vote, it's pretty close. 43.4% for Nixon and the Republicans, 42.7% for Humphrey and the Democrats, and 13.5% for George Wallace and the American Independent Party. Now, some historians call this a realigning election because this brings to an end the New Deal coalition that have been in control of American politics for the last 36 years. Because from 1932 to 1964, Democrats have won seven out of 9 presidential elections. They were undoubtedly the majority party, and their agenda influenced policies undertaken by Eisenhower. But from 1968 until 2004, Republicans won 7 out of 10 presidential elections, and its policies clearly affected those enacted by the Democratic Bill Clinton administration via the Third Way. And from 1968 until 2004, only 2 Democrats would be elected president, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. And this was a seismic event in the long-term realignment in Democratic Party support, especially in the South. Now the South becoming more Republican. That solid South coming to an end. The Democrats only managing to win Texas. Nixon ends up carrying North Carolinas, Tennessee, Virginia, and Florida. So this really brings an end to the solid South in the United States. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this election of 1968. Really important election. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos, go ahead and watch those if you want. And with that, we will see you next time with the election of 1972.